Living Alliance, and I'm the CEO of the BC Lung Association, and I'll be your moderator this morning. We're very pleased that you've been able to join us today. It's great to have such representation from across the province. We're here today to discuss a topic central to healthy living, and that is smoking prevention and protection from secondhand smoke. We have a very interesting program lined up for you, and I'll tell you about that shortly. But before we get rolling, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. If you are having any trouble hearing me, try turning up the volume on your phone or your computer. We want your input today, so we will be asking you to use the control panel on the right-hand corner of your screen. Type any questions you may have for our speakers as you think of them, and we will be having a question period after each speaker's presentation and a final round of questions at the end. Participate in some polls. We will give you a heads up, and you will see a blue screen that has multiple choice questions. Please respond to the polls as quickly as you can. You will only have a few seconds to do so, and then we'll publish the results for everyone to see. The polls will provide us, our panelists, and you with instant feedback. Again, we really want to hear your questions and comments. You can submit them at any time during a presentation by simply typing them in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and please indicate if there is someone in particular you are addressing your question to. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for, and if we miss any of them, we'll send out a post-event email with the missed questions and answers. I'd like to tell you about our program now. Although there has been tremendous progress in tobacco control over the past couple of decades in what is often dubbed the tobacco war, we've won many of the battles, but we still have a long way to go. There are still specific groups of people who remain addicted to this terrible substance. Our first speaker, Dr. Joan Botteriff, will explain how pregnancy and the early years are a prime opportunity to intervene and to prevent the negative health consequences that come from exposure to tobacco smoke, and potentially reduce the intergenerational transmission of the habit among those that are more likely to smoke. Our second speaker, Jonathan Polansky, will look at the way Big Tobacco is covertly marketing the appeal of smoking to young people through movies. This is a problem because young people are one of those groups that have higher rates of tobacco use and also some of the biggest consumers of film. While the smoking rate has decreased steadily for the average British Columbian to a low of just 14.3%, the rate among 20 to 25-year-olds is much higher. Our final speakers, Jack Boomer and Sharon Hammond, will explain the need for more dedicated smoke-free housing. While the majority of British Columbians don't smoke, in multi-unit buildings, 34% report being exposed to secondhand smoke that creeps in from neighboring units. Jack and Sharon will discuss some of the options to improve the living environment in British Columbia apartments, condo, townhouses, and suites. So that is just an overview of the webinar. But before I introduce our first speaker, we'd like to start with a question about you. We'll put this up as a poll in a minute or so and post the results. This will give you a little time to practice. And if you see that you fit into more than one category, then just choose the one that's the best fit for why you're joining in today. Now here comes that poll. We have 17% voted. If you haven't voted yet, check a box now. So 74% of you work in research or services, 20% work for government, and the much smaller numbers are in the business perspective or experience with tobacco or want to develop information in this area. So that's how the poll is going to work as the speakers present, so you've had a little time to practice that. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the morning, Dr. Joan Botteriff, who has been a great contributor to health promotion efforts in British Columbia. Dr. Bodareff is a professor in the School of Nursing and director of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention at UBC Okanagan. She's co-principal with the Investigating Tobacco and Gender Research Team and a lead investigator with Nexus. She served as the first dean of UBC's Okanagan Faculty of Health and Social Development and is chair in Cancer Prevention and Health Promotion. Her research interests include health promotion and health behavior change in the context of gender, cancer control, and genetic testing. Since the inception of FACET research program in 2002, Dr. Bodareff has led studies focused on understanding the social context of women's smoking with a specific focus on intimate relationships. Dr. Bodareff, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for that introduction and the invitation to be part of this panel. I'm delighted to be here to share some of our research, and what we think is what's next in prevention and protection has to do with integrating gender in our programs. And if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean by gender. Here, I'm focusing on things like masculinities and femininities and gender roles in our society. And although we don't think about it very often, gender has a huge influence on how we do health. And I think these magazines kind of illustrate that very well. And you might ask, so what does this have to do with tobacco? And in the next slide, you'll see that in actual fact, the tobacco companies have been taking up gender in their marketing campaigns for a long time, and these are really common and been very, very successful marketing strategies in terms of Marlboro Man, Virginia Slims, and you can see that the way that tobacco companies have integrated gender ideals in these messages to actually sell cigarettes, and as I said, they've been very successful. And although these marketing images are fairly old, in the next slide you'll see that in actual fact they still continue in modern versions, and so that I think points to the success of this kind of marketing strategy. However, it is interesting to think about that although tobacco companies have been using gender to influence tobacco-related behaviors, we haven't done that much ourselves in terms of tobacco control in also trying to use gender to influence and strengthen our support for smoking cessation. So in the next slide, I want to begin to tell you about some research that we've had underway for a number of years. If you can move forward in the next slide. Yes, that's the one. There you go. This is the FACET program of research, which focuses on families controlling and eliminating tobacco. And as you can see, families is our focus here. In particular, we were focusing on pregnant and postpartum families. And we chose this group because it's a group where we need to strengthen our efforts to support smoking cessation, but it's also a context where gender roles, gender influences play out in some very interesting ways that would help us understand how we might be able to integrate gender in our tobacco reduction interventions. So in the next slide, you'll see that here we were looking at couples and heterosexual couples, and as you can see, tobacco becomes very much integrated into couple interactions of various ways, and there's a lot of gender dynamics that we can begin to learn about here. And we discovered that it wasn't only when both people in the couple smoked, but even when one person smoked, smoking became integrated into their interactions and everyday dynamics in their household as they made room for smoking. So as we began to interview couples, and we did these interviews separately, we began to understand a little bit more about those dynamics. And in the next slide, I'm not going to go into these findings in great detail, but we were particularly focused in this particular part of the study on understanding women's efforts to reduce and stop smoking during pregnancy and how partners either supported or undermined those efforts. And as a part of that research, we identified some tobacco-related routines in those couple dynamics in those domestic contexts, as well as some couple or tobacco-related interaction patterns that we fondly call trips that influenced women's efforts at this time to reduce and stop smoking. And we learned about some of the challenges that of these relationships in terms of women's efforts to stop smoking. And we believed, in the next slide, we translated some of those findings into this booklet resource for women to help them understand how relationships dynamics influence their efforts to reduce and stop smoking, especially at the time of pregnancy, because that was what our focus was here. And it also offered some helpful suggestions to women to begin to develop strategies to respond to those dynamics, because those dynamics weren't always helpful to them. But, you know, in the course of doing this study, we realized that many of the male partners we were talking to were smokers. And we thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. Here we have a woman in a family who's trying to reduce and stop smoking. And we thought that this might be a cue to action for their male partners, that they might actually co-reduce, co-quit. And I have to say, we did find a few co-quitters, but they were very hard to find. And so we began to think about, well, exactly how many expectant new fathers smoke? Is this like a common occurrence? And so in the next slide, we began to ask, so how many fathers smoke out there? Because as you can imagine, it might be a bit challenging for a pregnant woman to reduce and stop smoking if her partner is continuing to smoke. And so I'm going to introduce a polling question here and get you to answer this question. Approximately how many young men aged 20 to 34 report being cigarette smokers? And I chose this age group because they're an age group that's likely or could be new fathers, expectant or new fathers. So take a moment and, as quickly as possible, try to identify the answer to that question. Okay, and as we can see here, most of you thought it was around 30%, and you're not far off. You're actually right on the money. So if we look at the next slide, you can see here, these are stats from the Canadian Community Health Survey 2011, and you can see actually male smoking is higher than female smoking almost at every age group, or the majority of the age groups, and particularly in that 20 to 34-year age group, and also the 35 to 44-year age group. So we might expect that there might be quite a few pregnant women out there trying to stop smoking in the context of a partner who continues to smoke. And in the next slide, you'll see that we found that when we began talking with these men, that few men actually reduced during their partner's pregnancy. And we do know as well that 15% of households report daily exposure to a smoker. So we became kind of curious about all of this and began to interview expectant new fathers about their smoking and their patterns of smoking once a baby arrived on the scene. And so in the next slide, we began to, through those interviews, begin to learn that actually as fathers, particularly as they became new fathers and became involved in childcare with their infants, that their identities began to shift. Before they had those babies, they were thinking and telling us that, you know, my smoking doesn't bother anybody. I'm just going to slip outside and, you know, it won't bother the baby, and, you know, it's my thing, and it doesn't happen around the house. But as they became fathers, they began to think about what kind of father they wanted to be. And we saw some shifts in masculinity. So as men took on those masculine ideals associated with fatherhood, the protector, the provider, and so on. And actually the stories from these fathers were very heartwarming because they really wanted to be good dads, the ideal dad for their child. And they wanted to be good role models. And those ideals challenged their resolve to smoking. And they began to think about, you know, maybe I do need to stop smoking, because they also didn't want their children to smoke. And so they started to become motivated to reduce and stop smoking because of these shifts. But very few of them did. And they explained that there was a lack of support for smoking cessation directed towards them, and that really us as healthcare providers were actually really paying very little attention to them. The focus was really on the mother and baby. And so in the next slide, it's interesting because all of our attention in pregnancy has been, and postpartum has been around focusing on mothers and helping them reduce and stop smoking. And yet we know that a partner smoking is one of the main risk factors for relapse during pregnancy, and particularly in the postpartum. So if we could figure out a way to help fathers reduce and quit smoking, we could actually support women's efforts to reduce and stop smoking. We could support men's health. We might even be able to prevent their MIs before they're 45 or 50. And of course, it would go a long way to creating smoke-free homes for children. So it is interesting that it has all of these positive benefits, but we really haven't paid much attention to actually supporting expectant and new dads. So in the next slide, we began to think about this gap and this challenge that men gave us. And using the data from our interviews with men and their suggestions about how best to support them, we began with this paper booklet that is a motivational tool, because although men appeared to be motivated, they weren't motivated enough to take the first step often and didn't know exactly how to take that first step. So this motivational booklet, unlike other approaches to motivation, really focuses on emotions and identities related to becoming a father. It's not about the facts about what smoking is going to do to you or your baby, but it's really on the importance of being a father and getting men to really think about that. And to support those shifts in masculine roles of fatherhood, we include testimonials because the fathers told us they really valued the advice and stories and support they could get from other fathers. So this booklet is written with the father, positioning the father as expert rather than the health provider. It's strength-based and has positive messages. So it's lots of messages about being a better father and so on, and the importance of fathers to children. And we try to give the resource a masculine look and feel, just as those tobacco advertisers do, a masculine look and feel, as a way to entice men to open this booklet, but also to read it and use it to help them think about their smoking. So in the next slide, here's just an excerpt of some of the pages from the booklet. We do include a true-false question and answer there to begin to impart some information, but to also engage them in the information. We also, and my screen just went blank. Okay, hang on. We also include this, we try to mimic the dilemmas that men were experiencing about being a guy who smokes to a man or to a father who wants to quit, as a way to strengthen that discrepancy that they were experiencing relating to being a dad who smokes, to again try to move them along the line to actually taking that first step. In the next slide, we we also wanted to support their autonomous decision-making. The men told us they wanted to make their own decisions about reducing and stopping smoking. And so there's no 10 steps in this resource. Rather, we include some of the ideas that other fathers gave us, and we encourage men to make their own choices here. In the next slide, we moved forward as well because men also challenged us to develop a group program. They told us they wanted to help each other and support each other. And so we developed the program Dads in Gear, which is an 8-week face-to-face program that is based on some of the men's health promotion principles that are drawn from our facet work. And in the next slide, these are the main program components. It's a unique program because it doesn't totally focus on tobacco reduction, but that's certainly one part of it. It also focuses on fathering because we believe that the more engaged we can help men be in fathering, the more motivated they'll be to reduce and stop smoking. And they're really interested in things around fathering at this time of their lives and very interested in being a better father. So there is a third of the program approximately focusing on fathering. The other component is exercise, and we included that for a few reasons. One, we know that exercise helps people stop smoking, but these men also wanted to be fit so they could play soccer with their children, and it was also a way to engage them in the program in an active way, and they really loved the exercise component. And these were integrated around some masculine themes. Every week had a different theme, and in the next slide you'll see that we used male facilitators and positive role models. We pilot tested this program in Community Fitness Center, and now in the next slide you'll see that we're moving to developing these resources for the DIG program in an online environment. So we're busy developing a website to incorporate some of the resources we developed in this group program because we learned that all men weren't able to participate in a face-to-face session on a regular basis. So we wanted to make the program materials accessible to men, and we wanted to support and sustain men's self-management as well, and we're hoping this tool will help them do that. And in the final slide, we're also spent the summer developing some 12 YouTube-style videos as some of the resources for the DIG program, and we're just putting the final touches on those now. And there are 4 on fathering, 4 on heart health, exercise and healthy eating, and 4 on tobacco reduction. And so we think that these would be a valuable addition to the web-based resource that we've been developing for DIG. And then in the next slide, final slide, our next steps are to, in the next month, we will be inviting fathers to come in and preview this website and the videos. We're going to get their feedback and then do some refinements to this before we decide how to move this forward. I guess our long-term goal is to figure out how to launch the DIG program with its web-based resources and perhaps with a face-to-face component in communities and to evaluate its effectiveness. In closing, I just want to note in the next slide our funding and collaborators. We've certainly been very well supported by CIHR for this work, and certainly very well supported by our collaborators who've really provided some valuable assistance along the way. And in the next slide, we have a website for our project, and we're also on Facebook and Twitter, and so it'd be wonderful if some of you are interested in liking us on Facebook and following us on Twitter. It would be great. And finally, in the very last slide, I do want to acknowledge the members of our research team. They're listed there. This work wouldn't be possible without the help of everyone who's been on our team. And I want to thank you for listening. And I want to introduce at this point my second polling question. And so if we could bring that up. The polling question is, who is best positioned to intervene directly with fathers to smoke to provide advice and support for smoking cessation? I'd like you to pick just the two best that you think who are best positioned. Because we're really interested in your answers to this question and also interested in any other ideas that you might have. So if I was only able to put 5 options here, so if you do know of other possibilities, tick that other box and perhaps we could hear from you about what those options might be. So I'll give you a few seconds to respond. Oh, great. Oh, so we see that most people thought nurses providing prenatal and postnatal support. Now that's interesting, very interesting. And quite a few people are saying others. So I'd love to hear from you about who those people are. And I'm also very happy to answer any questions or hear any comments you have about this work. We think it's a really important direction for beyond the next tobacco war. So I look forward to your comments and suggestions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Boderoff. It's very interesting to see how family relationships are so critical in supporting tobacco reduction or sometimes, unfortunately, undermining it. And it sounds like the FACEP program is really getting to the heart of the problem. We're going to have to move on. Now, you can send your questions. We will have Dr. Boderoff reply to them personally or at the question period at the end of the morning. And we'll move on to our second speaker, Jonathan Polansky, who first came to our attention through a report he did on Physicians for a Smoke-Free Canada. That report is called Tobacco Vector, How American Movies, Canadian Film Subsidies, and Provincial Ratings Practices Will Kill 43,000 Canadian Teens Today, and What Canadian Governments Can Do About It. The evidence and recommendations in that report has influenced some of BC Healthy Living Alliance's advocacy agenda. Jonathan is principal of the policy research and advocacy agency On Beyond, LLC, and has worked with the University of California at San Francisco Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education on the movie smoking issue since 2001. Other partners on this topic include the World Health Organization, the California and New York State Health Departments, and many other research and advocacy organizations in the United States, Canada, in Great Britain, Germany, New Zealand, and in India. Before founding On Beyond LLC in 2005, Mr. Polansky led creative strategy at the Public Media Center in San Francisco, where he helped frame and produce more than 200 campaigns in public health, environmental protection, rural development, women's labor, women's health, labor rights, education, and other issues with non-governmental organizations, foundations, and proactive public health agencies worldwide. Welcome, Jonathan. We're pleased to have you join us today.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to join you. That was such an interesting presentation we just saw. Gender is so often neglected. It's such a powerful lens for looking at these problems. But today I wanted to talk to you very quickly about the movie smoking issue and where British Columbia fits into the big picture. British Columbia is a center for feature film production, as you know, so it actually plays an active, not just passive role in this issue. First, I wanted to pose a polling question. In the last 2 or 3 years, how much smoking have you personally noticed in movies? More, less, about the same, or didn't really notice it at all? Please have your say. All right, that's interesting. Well, we'll see what the data says later in the webcast. I think you're probably very observant people. Next slide, please. We'll be covering, again, very quickly, the history of movie smoking, the science, the latest data about movie smoking, and the policy solutions that are broadly endorsed by leading health authorities. Oops.
Oops, sorry, technical trouble here.
We're about slide 3, I think.
We're just trying to restore the sequence here.
Okay, there you go. One back. There you go. Thanks. This is the early history. From the late 1920s into the 1950s, every major studio in Hollywood had a commercial relationship with the American tobacco industry. The studios cross-promoted their stars and films in advertising paid for by tobacco companies. The same studios are still active: Paramount, Warner Brothers, Fox, Columbia, Universal, today owned by larger media multinationals, Viacom, Time Warner, News Corporation, Sony, and Comcast. Next slide, please. During that period, 75% of top box office stars were on tobacco payrolls. Some of the names on the right, this is a partial list only, will be familiar to classic film fans. Barbara Stanwyck is my favorite, personally. Next slide, please. Not every top star, of course, had a tobacco advertising deal. Rin Tin Tin and Shirley Temple did not, so far as we know. Next slide, please. For 2 decades, tobacco shifted to broadcasting after 1950, but after U.S. TV and radio tobacco commercials were banned in 1970, the cigarette companies pursued systematic product placement campaigns touching more than 500 mainstream Hollywood films up to at least the mid-1990s. Next slide, please. All of this is documented in tobacco company files that have been revealed during lawsuits in the United States and elsewhere. The U.S. Congress spotlighted the problem in 1990. In 1998, the Master Settlement Agreement negotiated by state attorneys general in the U.S. barred paid product placement in youth-accessible entertainment. This was a legal deal, not a law. 3 major loopholes in that agreement, however, left tobacco on screen largely unaffected. In fact, it didn't peak until 2005. Next slide, please. Now for the science, there are 3 rulers that we use to measure the amount and import of tobacco in film. The first is intent of the studios. What are the percentage of their films that have smoking in them by rating and so forth? The second is performance. That is, how many tobacco incidents were in each film that had smoking. And then the impact on the audience. How many tobacco impressions did they deliver? Impressions is an advertising concept, meaning if one person sees one image one time, that counts as an impression. So it's incidents times paid admissions to films equals the impressions delivered as an index of audience exposure. Next slide, please. Besides looking at the movies and their performance, well-controlled population studies in at least 13 countries and regions, some with no tobacco advertising, others with more, all find the same thing. The more exposure to on-screen smoking, the more likely kids will become smokers. There's a causal relationship, it's dose-related, it's linear. Next slide, please. Here's the data for top-grossing movies released in the Canada-US market, what Hollywood calls its domestic, quote-unquote, territory, from 2002 to 2012. There are 1,575 such movies, and 60% featured smoking. Next slide, please. The percentage of films with smoking has fallen from 72% in 2002 to 49% in 2012 because of very growing public pressure in the United States and elsewhere on the studios to clean up their act. Well, that's progress, but next slide, please. Here are the movements year by year of the metric percentage of films with smoking. The blue bars are youth-rated movies, youth-rated in the U.S., that is. We'll get to that in a second. And the red bars are R-rated movies, 17 and older. Youth-rated movies, 80% of them had smoking in 2002, about 42% in 2010. But then if you notice, there's a rebound from 2010 up through 2012. 2012 is a bit obscured on this slide because we're still working out publication details with the U.S. CDC for the 2012 data, so bear with us. I just needed a little deniability there. Next slide, please. The second ruler is the tobacco incidence. There have been 30,000, actually 30,001, Since 2002, 44% of them were in youth-rated films. Next slide, please. Here you see the movement year by year and by rating. It shows, again, blue is youth and red is R-rated. It shows it peaks in 2005 like a wave and then falls off, but then starts rising again after really rather historic low in 2010. It bopped up in 2011 and bopped up quite a bit more in 2012. So next slide, please. If you look at where the smoking is under the U.S. rating system, at least, you'll see that tobacco incidents vary by the rating. On average, over the past decade, R-rated films had twice as many tobacco incidents as PG-13, which is like your 14A. That's important in British Columbia and other places where ratings give kids access to many U.S. R-rated films, as we'll see in a minute. Next slide, please. Here's another chart showing the time trends, another chart showing tobacco incidents in blue youth-rated films and reddish R-rated films. So a nice drop after 2005 and 6 in the wake of some congressional hearings in the U.S. and pressure from the attorneys general and others and all the voluntaries in the U.S. But a rebound again in the last couple of years. It's beginning to creep back up. It's sort of almost like where we were in 2002. Third, the final ruler, where the rubber meets the road, the impact on Canada and U.S. theater audiences. Total exposure from all film platforms. This is just in-theater exposure. It doesn't count home video and video on demand and online streaming and download and so forth. Maybe 7 or 10 times as great as the numbers that you're seeing here. These big numbers suggest why movie smoking could have such a substantial impact on public health. In Canada, the youth-rated impressions could be substantially higher share because they include heavy smoking films that are R-rated in the United States. Next slide, please. Here's the trend in those tobacco impressions over the past decade or so. We've begun calling this pattern the ski jump because it goes up, goes down, and then flips up at the end. Smoking goes downhill from mid-decade, then kicks up, and where will the young skier land? Well, next slide, please. If she lands in British Columbia, she's in even deeper trouble because in 2011 and 2012, 86% of movies with smoking were youth-rated in British Columbia compared to about half in the U.S. And that 51% of the U.S. has proven to be a big problem for us, so imagine how big a problem 86% of those smoking movies being youth-rated, accessible to youth, is in British Columbia. You don't need to imagine because you're looking at it in terms of the impressions those films delivered. As a direct result of rating differences in the last 2 years, more than 90% of tobacco impressions were delivered by youth-rated films in British Columbia. So Canadian kids potentially get substantially more exposure than even their U.S. counterparts. The red slices showing what's being delivered by R-rated movies are somewhat smaller than they were in the previous slide because R-rated movies sell fewer tickets than youth-rated movies do, which is why everyone is recommending that smoking be adult-rated in order to create a market disincentive for producers to keep smoking out of films that they intend to be youth-rated. Well, what harm does all this exposure do? This is the latest estimate of attributable risk based on peer-reviewed U.S. population studies. 37%, 400,000 past month U.S. smokers 12 to 17 recruited by exposure to on-screen smoking. Next slide, sorry. There you go, thank you. Sorry, I should have left it off my sheet. And that 125,000 of those 400,000 current 12 to 17-year-old smokers are projected to die from tobacco-induced diseases in decades to come. Now, the risk is likely higher in Canada because there's no conventional tobacco advertising there, so that exposure to movie smoking plays a larger role, unlike the U.S., and because R-rated movies with smoking are allowed to be dumped over the border into Canada's youth market. Next slide, please. Here's a rough estimate of what a 37% attributable risk means when applied to Canada's smoking prevalence among 15 to 19-year-olds. Please consider this preliminary. We'll be happy to recalculate it for the 12 to 17-year-old cohort, so it will be somewhat lower because the prevalence will be lower. But in any case, you can see that there are sizable numbers at risk in later adolescence in Canada, and while not directly comparable because the age cohort is different, the U.S. has large numbers too. These are studies, by the way, that have controlled for every other known factor influencing or associated with youth smoking, including parents smoking, friends smoking, how well they're doing in school, risk-taking characteristics, about a dozen or 13 different factors in all. So this is very rigorous stuff to isolate the influence of the exposure to movie smoking. Besides, next slide, please. Besides the 35,000 premature deaths projected among the current cohort of young Canadian smokers, there are other costs, like for lifetime health care. For the 15 to 19-year-olds smoking because of their exposure to on-screen smoking, it might be around 3 billion Canadian dollars. Next slide, please. BC is itself a film production center, so we looked at the top-grossing films that U.S. studios made in British Columbia over the past decade and their contribution to the problem. So there were 110 Hollywood movies shot in British Columbia in the last 10 years or so. 51, nearly half of those had smoking in them, 5% of the total. They contributed 1,000 incidents, about 4% of the total, and 8.2 billion domestic in-theater tobacco impressions, about 3% of the total. And of course, these films are seen around the world, so the harm these movies may do is not confined to BC or to Canada or to the U.S., but all over the place. Next slide, please. Now, the companies developing these smoking films, whether they're shot in BC or in the United States or elsewhere, bear the most responsibility, and this table shows which big U.S. media companies delivered the biggest share of tobacco impressions. Number one is Time Warner, that's Warner Brothers, at 34%, about a third. That's in the last year. And number two is Sony at 18%. Sony is Columbia and Sony Films. News Corp is Fox, Comcast is Universal, Viacom is Paramount, and the indies also make a contribution. Next slide, please. Of all these big companies, except for News Corporation, all of them have a corporate policy that discourages, quote-unquote, smoking in their youth-rated films. Sony and Viacom got on the wagon just in the last couple of months because of a Surgeon General report and a very strong letter from the Attorneys General this past year. But the policies have shortcomings, as we'll see. Next slide, please. In fact, there's not much evidence that these individual corporate policies lead to sustained change at all. The difference between policy and non-policy companies was quite important in 2010. The studios with policy had just about one incident per youth-rated film, tobacco incident, while studios without policies had 10 times as many. But by 2011, the difference was negligible, insignificant, and in 2012, they both increased by the same amount, and again, the difference was just insignificant. So what does work? Next slide, please. How am I doing for time, by the way?
We're getting close.
Okay. Here are the 4 policy goals endorsed by leading health authorities worldwide, including WHO, U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I wish we had more time to talk about these, but I hope this slide deck will be available to you. Number 1 is to adult rate future movies with smoking, with a couple of categorical exceptions. Number 2 is to run strong anti-tobacco spots before any smoking movie in any channel. Number 3 is to stop showing tobacco brands in movies, period. Number 4 is to certify no payoffs for the appearance of tobacco in a movie. That is to sign a legally binding declaration that nobody got any payola for tobacco in a film. These are all evidence-based and have led the conversation globally since 2002. The fifth, next slide, please. The fifth policy is to make future media productions with smoking ineligible for public subsidies, tax credits, and so-called incentives. The bottom line is that the people of a dozen countries are financially backing large budget U.S. films with smoking. BC's subsidies for films total between $50 and $100 million a year. A little hard to figure out because they don't exactly declare it, break it out in the way that you wish. In Washington State, right across your border, there's a move to change the rules of their film incentive program to make smoking films ineligible. There was also a big move in California to attempt that in the last legislative session. Next slide, please. Just for a little background here, I know that film subsidies are in the news in BC right now because the film industry is lobbying for them to be increased. That would be the 4th increase since 2004. They're now at 33%, which is quite high, and this graph shows that British Columbia, in blue, actually has been dominating feature film production all the way along. So you can make your own judgment about what big trouble they're in. This doesn't include TV series, movies for television, and so on, which are also a big part of the tax credit scheme, to be fair. So the connection to smoking, next slide please. In the last 10 years, BC tax credits for films with smoking may have totaled $175 million. And this is a chart over time also showing the moving average. So if you want to be conservative, you say $15 million a year in BC in taxpayer money is going to subsidize big budget Hollywood movies with smoking that damage the health of kids in British Columbia and around the world. I don't know how much you all spend on tobacco control in British Columbia, but the chances are, as in many states in the U.S., that they're spending more on these smoking movies than they are on tobacco control. That's called blowback, where I come from. As an FCTC signatory, next slide please. As an FCTC signatory, you might like to know that WHO says that subsidizing movies with smoking is contrary to the treaty that Canada signed on tobacco control. So you have some leverage there. Next slide please. And the U.S. Surgeon General in 2012 endorsed the R rating, as have the 2/3 of state attorney generals in the U.S. and plenty of other health authorities around the planet. Next slide please. I like the language from the state attorneys general in the letter that they wrote this year. Further on, they noted that companies knowingly harm children and youth each time they release a movie with smoking. Knowingly in legal language is very strong because it means that somebody did it with intention, knowing the harm that they were going to do and that the liability might ensue. So it's that kind of language that's being traded back and forth in the U.S. about this issue between public health and legal authorities and the media companies at this point. The basic next slide, please. Last one. The basic strategy is to increase the cost of tobacco on screen using evidence-based policies to create market disincentives like the R rating or the 18A rating. It's not censorship, it's extensions of current methods that are used to regulate and create voluntary incentives for keeping, damaging or harmful content out of films that kids see. And it's to blunt the tobacco industry's historically persistent exploitation of film to sell smoking and their brands. That brings us to the final poll, if we have time.
Yes, go ahead, sure.
Okay, which tactics do you believe BC can use to shape Hollywood's behavior? You can check more than one. Rates future movies with smoking imagery 18A to discourage tobacco content in future films. Make productions with smoking ineligible for BC tax credits. Require film producers to certify no payoffs in order to be eligible to get a film rating in British Columbia. And require strong anti-tobacco spots before smoking movies in all media. If you check none of the above, I should have also said other, so if there are other suggestions you have, you can check that box. But check the ones that you think would be most feasible in BC and that you believe would be most effective. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, for your presentation. Very interesting, the relationship between tobacco and tobacco consumption and some of the avenues that might be considered in the future. Really appreciate that. And again, if people have questions for Jonathan, Jonathan's address is available if you want to contact him yourself, or at the end of the session this morning, we will try and address your questions as much as we can. We have several for Joan, which we'll include in that at the end of the session. Right now, we'd like to move on to Jack Boomer and Sharon Hammond, our final presenters, both of whom have had a lot of experience with the BC Healthy Living Alliance and its effort to reduce tobacco use in the province. Jack headed up the BC Healthy Living Alliance's tobacco reduction strategy from 2006 to 2010, overseeing a comprehensive province-wide approach targeted to 19 to 29-year-olds in the workplace, at post-secondary institutions, and in community settings. Sharon Hammond played a major role implementing the tobacco reduction strategy as manager of our smoke-free housing initiative. Jack is currently a principal of Context Research based in Vancouver and director of the Clean Air Coalition of BC. Since 1999, the Clean Air Coalition of BC, which includes the Heart and Stroke Foundation and the BC Lung Association, has worked to reduce the harm caused by tobacco use and exposure to secondhand smoke. He is the director of Quit Now Services with the BC Lung Association and has been since 2004. He is working on numerous tobacco programs with governments and organizations across Canada and was a member of the Tobacco Info editorial board. He has been involved with smoke-free housing issues since 2004 when the Clean Air Coalition developed Canada's first smoke-free housing brochure. Since then, he and Sharon have worked on smoke-free housing issues in BC and have also developed a smoke-free housing website, which is www.smokefreehousing.ca, that directs people to their respective provincial services, including BC's smoke-free housing website. Sharon Hammond is a senior consultant at Context Research, specializing in project management and program implementation with a focus on tobacco cessation. She also is a social media expert, having played a key role in developing and implementing public education campaigns using social media strategies. She recently developed the Quit Now Services online program on behalf of the BC Lung Association, as well as its Quit Now by Text program. Welcome, Jack and Sharon.
Thanks, Scott, and it is great to be here this morning and to follow Joan and Jonathan. And one of the criteria for presenting this morning was not that your name had to start with J, because we are going to have Sharon presenting with us this morning. The first slide says the new frontier, secondhand smoke and multi-unit dwellings, and as Scott mentioned, this is not really a new frontier because this is something that's been percolating for quite a while, and in fact we've tried to keep it somewhat under the radar system because there's not a lot that can be done, and we're going to share a little bit about that this morning because we know that there's no smoking in bars, pubs, restaurants, increasingly in parks, beaches, and playgrounds. There's no smoking, and so people are smoking in their castle, in their home. So we're going to go to the next slide, please, and we're going to just do a bit of a poll. Are we able to go to the poll? There we go. So I guess from your perspective or where you sit, how often have you been contacted about secondhand smoke in multi-unit dwellings, which would include a townhouse or a condo or apartment building or duplex, by someone about this issue? If you could vote, we'd sure appreciate it, just to give a sense of the scope of the issue. Okay, let's see how everyone did. So there's a number of people that are being contacted monthly, and we can see that some people are contacted weekly about this issue. And so we're going to just, if we could go to the next slide, what we're going to cover this morning very briefly, because our time is limited, is just to highlight what the scope of the issue is, and many of you are familiar with the issue. What are some of the barriers and benefits of smoke-free multi-unit dwellings? What are others doing, and what's going to be happening next? Before we go to the next slide, I'd just like to read you a quote of a complaint or an issue that we received, because we receive weekly people contacting us through the Smoke-Free Housing website. This is an actual quote that I'm going to read, or question. "I can't take this anymore. She moved in new tenants who do the same thing as the tenants she recently moved out to the building next door. Because of my complaints, why would she do that? Move in new smokers who do the exact same thing, smoke in the bedroom below me all night when I should be sleeping. Completely an abuse of power. My doctor can't believe this." He shook his head in disgust and said, "She was stupid. She knows how ill I am. Last night I thought both my lungs were going to collapse. I was coughing and wheezing so hard I couldn't catch my breath. My son looked out the window and some guy below my window was blowing smoke out his window up into my room. This is my sanctuary. I spend a lot of time in here because I am ill now. I am on oxygen." And the quote, the story goes on for another couple of paragraphs. We get these kinds of questions or comments from people asking for help of what to do. So if we could go to the next slide. One of the things that we know is that with respect to smoke-free, and we're sort of preaching to the choir here, we know that levels of smoking are low nationally. They're about 18%. In BC, as Scott mentioned at the start of the presentation, we're at around 14% of the population that smokes. That still translates in BC to about 550,000 people that smoke. We know that there's no smoking in bars, pubs, restaurants, as I mentioned just a moment ago, and that typically people are not allowing people to smoke indoors in their homes. And that, some Health Canada data from 2003 reported that smoking inside was that only about 11% allow people to regularly smoke inside their home. But what's happening is we also know that there's increasing demand for smoke-free environments. In a survey that we did with support from the BC Healthy Living Alliance in 2008, BC Stats helped us. They found that majority of renters in condos would prefer a 100% smoke-free building. We can go to the next slide. And again, we're sorry we don't have all the exciting pictures that Joan and Jonathan had, but we wanted to really just provide you with some grounding with the issue. And that is, why go smoke-free? Well, we all know that secondhand smoke is a serious health hazard with upwards of 40 to 60 carcinogens, depending on how you do the count. Secondhand smoke cannot be contained or ventilated, and that is why smoking is banned in bars, pubs, restaurants, and indoor public places. When we did the survey with BC Stats in 2008, we found that about 1/3 of the residents are exposed to secondhand smoke in BC. And what we find as part of the study is that a lot of them are affected by secondhand smoke, but they don't do anything about it. They don't complain to their landlord. They don't complain to anyone or ask their neighbor next door to quit smoking because they feel nothing will be done and that they feel almost paralyzed. And more often than not, they will just move or put up with it. But what we're finding now as more and more people are becoming aware of the issue, that they're trying to do something about it, and they will contact us, or they may contact many of you that are on the phone or on the call today. We also know that more renters smoke, and so it makes the rental population more vulnerable. And in our study, we found that as a percentage, if typically we know that if somebody makes a little bit more money and they and may be able to afford housing, that they may be able to afford a condo or a single unit home, and therefore they likely will not be as affected. So renters are much more affected and vulnerable, especially in social housing, and we'll talk a little bit about social housing in just a moment. If we could go to the next slide, which is it's a polling question, actually. Brenda, if you wouldn't mind doing the polling question. So Scott mentioned at the start of the call about the smokefreehousing.bc.ca website, and before today, you might have logged on instead of listening. Have you ever heard or visited the smokefreehousing.ca website? If you could just vote. Okay, let's see how people did. Okay, so that's really fantastic for us, is that many of you have never visited the website, and hopefully we're going to be able to share about this and give you a resource that you may be able to refer people to. If we could go to the next slide. As Scott mentioned, we've been working on this issue since 2004. In fact, in 2004, the Heart and Stroke Foundation and the Lung Association were given a small amount of money to create Canada's first ever smoke-free housing brochure on this issue, and we were quite proud of it because it was even translated into French and distributed across Canada. The bottom line was there wasn't a lot that could be done to assist people, but we were starting to work on the issue and try to support people a little bit. Through 2008 to 10, through the BC Healthy Living Alliance, there was support to help develop the website and help to increase options for people around this issue. And as we say, we know that demand for smoke-free housing is increasing. We sometimes will receive up to 50 complaints through the website a month asking for support and what can they do. Let's go to the next slide. We know that with respect to defining what the smoke-free housing issue is, we know that there is a shortage of smoke-free housing, and we define multi-unit housing as for-profit or rental, non-profit housing, condos, and co-ops. Our goal increasingly is to increase options for smoke-free homes and to protect British Columbians from secondhand smoke. And as noted there, in 2006, about 40% of British Columbians or households live in multi-unit dwellings, and we know that or expect that number is increasing, but that's from 2006. If we could go to the next slide, what we define as a no smoking policy is basically a very specific clause in a tenancy agreement or lease that would say there's no smoking indoors or where it's banned inside, outside on the balconies, possibly on the property, and there could even be that there's a designated area on the property where people could smoke that's far enough away from the building that will not we would use the word drift or come into the building. One of the challenges is that existing tenants must be grandfathered. So if somebody new is moving into a building and asks for a no smoking clause, or is this a no smoking building, sometimes landlords will say there is no smoking, it's a no smoking building, we're moving in that direction. But for existing tenants, they cannot impose that upon them unless there's an agreement with the tenant. It does not, and this is key, it does not ban smokers from renting or living in a smoke-free building. What it does is it restricts or bans where people can smoke. And we're not talking about forcing tenants to quit smoking, again, but restricting where they would smoke, and does not talk about evicting tenants who smoke. If we could go to the next polling question that we have, and again, we're moving very quickly here because these slides will be posted. Is smoking a protected right under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Please vote. Okay, Brenda. True or false? Well, you're correct. Smoking is not a protected right under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is not a protected right. And in fact, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers. And I'm going to turn it over to Sharon, who deals with a lot of the complaints that we receive and has done a lot of presentations on this issue as well, to talk, and if we could move to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Sharon.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I think probably the biggest barriers that we sometimes find from landlords and strata corporations when they're considering the issue of smoke-free policies is their fear around whether it's legal, the belief that the policy may be discriminatory, and enforcement issues. And so it's really difficult trying to dispel some of the myths that are out there, and that's probably one of our biggest challenges, because basically once landlords implement no smoking policies, or they go smoke-free, or they find that their building is getting down to mostly non-smokers in the building, or lack of complaints from people of secondhand smoke, they love it, right? The benefits are quite clear. So the issue around legality, is developing or adopting a no smoking policy legal in BC, and the answer is absolutely yes. It is legal. The only thing that you have to ensure is that the clause is very clear in the tenancy agreement, and you can't backdate a no smoking policy. You have to grandfather existing tenants, but certainly in the rental world, the average renters move about every 2 years. So if somebody wanted to develop a no smoking policy in a building, over a few years, they could actually have that building pretty well non-smoking as tenants move, and they bring in new tenants and get them to sign non-smoking agreements. The issue around whether non-smoking policies are discriminatory, and that's probably the biggest barrier that we face. The bottom line is the weight of the evidence indicates that no smoking policies are not discriminatory. It's not it's a no smoking policy. It's not a no smoker policy, and it is not identified in the Charter or the Human Rights Code as grounds for protection. And again, the idea around freedom to smoke does not mean that you have an absolute right to smoke, especially if other people are affected by it. So I think that that's one of the things that we, and when we're talking to housing providers about the issue of adopting smoke-free policies or accommodation for smokers or non-smokers, pretty well all the cases that we've heard about, and there are many cases that have been heard now at the Human Rights Tribunal and that are still pending decisions, they have all been put forward by people who have disabilities or some kind of health problem that is being exacerbated by exposure to the secondhand smoke. And landlords are finding that in fact decisions are being made where they need to accommodate the non-smoker and the person with health conditions who's being exposed in the home. So we don't know of any cases where a smoker has come forward where they have been allowed to continue to smoke where it's affecting other tenants. There was one case, it's a rather famous Cominco case, and it had to do with smoking on the grounds. And the bottom line with that was the disability, it was found that there might have been a disability when it came to withdrawal symptoms of nicotine withdrawal. And in that case, accommodation might have meant, providing nicotine replacement. So there are ways to accommodate people who do have significant addiction issues by providing them with free NRT, which we know in BC we do have the government program that provides support for these nicotine replacement products. So that's something really good to explain to housing providers, that they can help their residents who are concerned about not smoking within the units. So that, those are fairly easily dispelled as long as you can get the information out. The whole issue around enforcement, I think that that's kind of a red herring, because basically if you're a housing provider and you've got tenants who have signed a tenancy agreement that includes a no smoking policy, basically if there's non-compliance around that, that's a breach of a material term of the tenancy, and it could result in eviction under the Residential Tenancy Act. And basically, you would just tell housing providers, look, enforce your no smoking policy just like you would any other policy that you have within your tenancy agreement, like no pets or no barbecues, that kind of thing. And you'll also, with housing providers, what we've heard is that, other tenants in the building will be the first ones to come forward and let them know if somebody else is in non-compliance of the smoking clause. And economic concerns about, will the landlords be able to rent their suites? Well, what we've found is certainly in market housing, it's not a problem. And when you look at the percentages of people who don't smoke in BC, you've got a huge market of residents who are looking for no smoking policies. And believe me, there's tons of places where smokers are living, and so we're just looking to increase the number of places where people can live without, having smoke infiltrating their home on a regular basis. And certainly through surveys that we did when we got our funding through the BC Healthy Living Alliance, we found that landlords and strata corporations that implemented these smoke-free policies absolutely love them. They just, and that's where you can go probably to, I didn't mention the thing about inertia, and that just comes down to a lot of times landlords just don't have the resources available to know how to go about implementing a smoke-free policy, and that's where our website comes in. We have tons of resources on that website, and we refer landlords and strata corporations to it all the time. There's a section for landlords, there's a section for tenants, and then there's a section for condo owners and strata councils. And basically we have sample legal opinions from lawyers. We have sample bylaws that they can implement for strata corporations. We have sample wording because we had help from the residential tenancy organizations to help us come up with clauses to include in their tenancy agreements. So there's all kinds of resources on that website that you can refer landlords. Also for tenants who are experiencing secondhand smoke problems, there's tons of information on the website for what they can do to take steps to address the issue with their landlord, or possibly go to the residential tenancy branch. Anyway, and then the benefits is the next slide. Basically, it's kind of a no-brainer. The benefits for landlords, housing providers, and condo owners: reduced maintenance, cleanup costs, reduction in fire, complaints from residents. Yeah, so basically, once we sort of get the information out to landlords, it's a lot easier to get them to look at the issue and possibly consider going smoke-free. So, Jack, do you want to? I know we don't have a lot of time left.
Sure. So if we could go to the next slide, Brenda, and thanks, Sharon. So one of the things that we just wanted to highlight, and we're not going to go through these, but to just say that starting in 2006 and even before then, many landlords were starting to make their property smoke-free, and you can just go through want ads now. If you go on Craigslist or Kijiji or places where people are posting homes or rentals, you'll see smoke-free housing or smoke-free property. So North Vancouver, the condo, Envy condo, was purpose-built to be 100% smoke-free from the beginning. We have examples all across Canada. In Manitoba, I know that we have someone here from Manitoba on the call who actually Globe agencies with 5,000 units were going to go smoke-free over time. And so we just have these all sorts of examples of these. Many of them are nonprofit housing societies. We have lots of examples in BC about that. If we could go to the next slide. A couple things that we just wanted to highlight were some trends. In Ontario, we just spoke to some of our colleagues there. They have 70 social and nonprofit housing providers that are smoke-free in Ontario already. In BC, we have about 50 to 60 that we know about, but we expect that increasingly more and more are going in that direction because, as Sharon mentioned, the benefits of lack of complaints, reduced possibilities of fires are tremendous. There are 10 municipalities in California, and Jonathan would be very familiar with this, that have actually banned smoking in indoor units completely so that there's no smoking in units within that municipality. And one thing that we talked about but didn't put on the list when Sharon and I were editing this was that there are a number of municipalities in the states that are requiring that when you are renting a unit that you disclose whether smoking was permitted in the building or in the unit or not, or smoking has occurred in the unit or not, so that people are aware up front when they're renting. Michael Bloomberg in New York, he announced some cash incentives for smoke-free buildings, and essentially you have to have 2 buildings that go smoke-free with a minimum of 30 units, and then they can get up to $10,000 cash. So it is an incentive, and not a legislative requirement, but an incentive to go smoke-free. I just mentioned about we did add it. I apologize about the requiring housing units to declare whether they're what the smoke-free status is, and that there is some places where legislation will require condos to be smoke-free from the outset. Again, likely in California. You know, one of the trends and issues that we're facing, and I would be interested in Jonathan's thoughts on this later, is the whole issue of e-cigarettes and the fact that if e-cigarettes are being shown in movies or on TV shows, is that considered a tobacco impression? Because increasingly there are so many issues around e-cigarettes and what this is going to do in terms of renormalizing tobacco use potentially. We're lucky in Canada that there's some research going on with Pam Kaufman out of the University of Waterloo to look at the way that people implement smoke-free bylaws and policies. For example, in the Yukon and in Nova Scotia, I believe, they're allowed to not have grandfathering clauses, or so that you can actually, a landlord can say, as of June 30th, we're going to go smoke-free in the building, and it's going to be smoke-free completely. We do not have that legislation or that ability in BC. Could you go to the next slide? So we're fortunate, and this presentation is timely because the Heart and Stroke Foundation and the Lung Association just received some funding to do some more work in this area of smoke-free housing, and we look forward to working with our partners on the call in the province. We want to update the environmental scan and look a little bit more at what some of the latest issues and trends are and what can be done. We need to update our website. We have some old logos. We have some information where we can post some new material or what some of the latest trends are. We need to update statistics from 2008 in terms of people that are exposed to secondhand smoke in multi-unit dwellings and what they're doing about it. And we would like to work with the tobacco control community around initiatives related to smoke in multi-unit dwellings. The next couple of slides, if you turn to the next one, Brenda, this is the list. Sharon talked about the smoke-free housing website, and these are some of the resources that are there. You can go and look at it. This will be posted. If you go to the next slide, the takeaway message for everyone today is basically that this is about increasing options for smoke-free homes and protecting people from secondhand smoke. We truly have reached a tipping point. There is a shortage of secondhand smoke, or a shortage of, not secondhand smoke, but a shortage of smoke-free housing. And what we need to do is to increase those options because increasingly society is moving to smoke-free living. So basically, we look forward to working and hearing from you. There's our contact information. Many of you are familiar with how to get in touch with us. There's many ways. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack and Sharon. Great presentation, a very interesting topic. And everybody has the smokefreehousingbc.website, and we suggest you go and have a look. There's some great stuff there. We're going to move to our own poll again before we go on to the little question period. We've received a number of questions in the background during the presentations. We have questions for each of the panelists, which we'll be getting to in a minute. Right now, we'd like you to complete our poll, which should be on your screen now. Well, they run pretty close together there. A lot of interest in all of those topics. We've received some questions, and we were able to take questions for about the next 10 or 12 minutes, and we're going to lose our connection. We have a question here for Joan. This person notices that you use language of reduction or quitting smoking. I wonder if you could speak to any resistance you've had to using a reduction as a strategy and strategies you've used to address this resistance.
Interesting question. I think we usually say reducing and quitting smoking. And based on our work with fathers in particular, we noted that many of them have tried and do a period of reduction before they finally decide that they can quit. Other people try the cold turkey approach. We know that there's no evidence to suggest one approach is better than the other. So, so we use those words, reducing and quitting. We have had a little bit of pushback, particularly in relation to pregnant and postpartum women in our work there. However, we take the approach that we want to start where people are willing to start and think they're able to start. So if it's with reducing, we're happy to start there with them and encourage them and support them in reducing. And we think that through that, then we have an opportunity to begin to, or they have an opportunity to begin to think about when they want to quit and how we can support that. So we kind of take the small steps approach and to a lot of our messaging and provide a way into smoking cessation in a number of ways to try and create some opportunities for people who might not otherwise consider stopping.
Great, thanks, Joan.
I don't know. I'm hoping that answers the question.
Jonathan,
Yes.
What message do you have for those decision makers who are wary of regulation and would prefer to promote the voluntary approach for the removal of tobacco from films?
Well, I think they should look at the history of tobacco in film and see that repeated attempts to take a laissez-faire approach ends up depressing tobacco in film for a while, and then it reverts. All that we and others are asking for are voluntary measures. There's no sense that a government should censor tobacco content. It's just, subsidies are voluntary. You can take them or not. Ratings are things that if they believe smoking should be in their film and they believe strongly enough about it, then they should stand up and take an adult rating for it, just as they do for certain depictions of sexual activity or explicit violence. So all of this is voluntary, really. It's just the decisions being made on the part of the producers in a certain market environment, which is properly regulated by public policy. It's not a departure from what has been done before as far as movies and movie content and subsidies for movies. There are plenty of conditions on movie subsidies in plenty of places that have nothing to do with smoking, but may have to do with pornographic images and other things like that. So for giving them money, you have a choice about what you give money to for a public benefit.
Okay, Sharon or Jack, I've got a question about public housing. Can you tell us whether BC Housing or other nonprofit housing agencies are making any changes currently to protect residents with chronic disease or with children in their units? Are any steps being taken now in public housing in BC?
Well, I'll take a bit of a stab at it and then Sharon pipe in. we believe that BC Housing has actually changed their intake form to ask the question, are you a smoker or not? But we're not aware that that has significantly influenced what they do with respect to that and where they place people. So, it's a very modest step in the right direction. But there are a number of nonprofit housing providers that have actually put in place making their units and their buildings 100% smoke-free or creating a policy. So there is moves, but BC Housing per se, I think I'm not 100% aware. Sharon, are you?
No, I would say that the few steps that they've taken hasn't made that much of a difference in people's lives. So many people we hear who are living in subsidized housing situations, and it's a real crisis point. I think we get complaints like similar to the example that Jack gave, where they don't have the option of moving, which is really tough. And even if they did move, to find another public housing complex that has 100% smoke-free units is almost impossible to find in BC. So we're going to have a bit more of a critical mass of housing providers that provide smoke-free housing, and maybe they need more incentives. I don't know, but it's a strong barrier, and we recognize that they're dealing with a more vulnerable population of people and higher smoking rates within that population for sure. But there's so many people who are living in public housing situations because of health problems, because a lot of times they can't work or they've got asthma or whatever disability they have, and they have nowhere to go. So it's critical that we get some movement on that.
Okay, Sharon, a supplementary question. Is there a listing of low-income housing, non-smoking low-income housing available today, and can people see that list somewhere?
Well, we do have on the Smoke Free Housing website, we do have a registry of housing providers that, and it's separated by health authority. But unfortunately, not enough housing providers know about the place to if they are going smoke free to post there. Although we do still get some people who register on the site. You can go there now on the site and search for non-smoking complexes, but there aren't that many, I have to say. And when we get more money, we're hoping that we'll be able to advertise the registry a little bit more, and for those who are considering it or have already gone smoke-free that we don't know about, because maybe there's some that we just don't know about, and obviously I'm sure that's the case. Hopefully they will register their buildings on our website.
Scott, if I could just add, one of the things that we're heartened by is that because of the resources that are on the website, a number of condos have actually gone 100% smoke-free. And when I was talking to our colleagues in Ontario, they actually have very few condos that they're aware of that have gone smoke-free. Whereas in BC, there seems to be enough of a movement that in a critical mass where people are actually going to their annual general meetings, putting forward a smoke-free policy and actually getting it passed. And we're going to be trying to find those as well and use them as success stories so that others can hear about them. But we've worked with some condo stratas that have done that. So anyway.
Yeah, and actually it's been quite helpful to have because we paid for, through the BC Healthy Living Alliance initiative that we were working on, we paid for legal opinions on adopting smoke-free policies for strata councils, and we also had the lawyer develop a sample bylaw, and we get lots of requests for those that they put forward at their general meetings when they're discussing these issues.
Thank you. Joan, we've got a question as to how would an individual become involved in the Dads in Gear program?
Oh, that's a great question. We'd love to hear from people who want to become involved, certainly. So the best way is to contact us directly, and we'd be happy to follow up and see what we can do about getting people involved, especially in the next steps as we move forward. It would be great to hear from people who are interested.
Okay, great. We'll have the addresses, everybody's address available. Jonathan, there's a question here about tobacco on television. What's being done there? We see tobacco on a number of television shows. This person references chef shows on the Food Network. What's going on in TV and smoking?
Well, there are people who are interested in that. There's been some hesitation among the, the global partners working on this to start going heavily into the television problem because we think it might dilute efforts. There is a different level of prestige for feature films than for television production, so that we thought that if it was fixed in movies that it would be then easier to fix in television, but not in the reverse. Television doesn't have an effective age classification or rating system to be used, so the tools are a bit vaguer that you could get a hold of. On the other hand, television tends to be a bit more heavily regulated still than movies are because of public ownership of airwaves in various jurisdictions and so forth. But the feeling is if you get it out of movies, it'll get taken care of in television. There may be a toothpaste effect that if we're squeezing it out of movies, it may be showing up more on television. And I think people should remain alert. And if anybody wants to monitor that, which would be very difficult to do because of the number of channels and programs, they're very welcome to do it. And we'd love to see the data.
Thanks, Jonathan. Jack and Sharon, I guess this will be our last question for the panel. How can building owners or strata owners be motivated to initiate a smoke-free policy within their buildings?
Well, I think one of the first things is just to talk about the benefits, because the bottom line is that it reduces their costs, so that it's the money cost of the fact that if they are smoke-free, the remediation will, like when a tenant moves out, the cost for a smoking tenant is tremendous, and we have the information on the website. I think that reducing the number of complaints, having happier tenants, and likely they will stay longer. And so those are just a few things. Sharon?
Well, I would say that like for strata councils, one of the big concerns is usually around the issue of the legality of it, because we usually get legal questions around that. So there's a lot of myths, so it's a matter of dispelling those myths, but also dispelling them with the idea that they're reluctant, it seems to me, to develop any bylaws that could in any way have a restriction on sales. And so their concern is that if they have these no smoking policies, that somehow that's going to impact the sale of the units, and they're hesitant about that. So again, it's education. It's education around what the smoking rates are, the number of people in BC that want no smoking, especially in the condo population, and then again with landlords, it's different issues. But again, it's just getting the information out there about the legality mostly, I would suspect, because I think they do know about the no-brainers, the issues around fire, that kind of thing. So it's yeah, it's reaching them with the numbers and the legal aspect.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Joan, Jonathan, Jack, and Sharon. Thanks so much for sharing your research and knowledge with us today on this call, as well as for all the work you do on an ongoing basis to make it easier for us to breathe here in BC. And Jonathan, I guess we're in a wider audience than that, you based out of San Francisco. Thanks to everybody in the audience for your attention and thoughtfulness. We're really glad to have you able to join us today. We will be following up with a very short survey that we hope you'll respond to give us a better idea of how we should approach these webinars in the future, what is working and what is not working. We will be continuing this series, so watch your inbox for notice of those. We'll be holding the next one in March. I want to also thank and acknowledge Rita and Samantha and Brenda here in the office. Brenda particularly, who's been under some considerable stress ensuring that the technology worked here today. Thanks so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.